All right. Hello, everybody. As you guys trickle in here, I'm going to get us started. So my name is Brianna Coma, and I'm with Conservation Nebraska. Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to learn all about plants tonight. A couple of reminders while everybody is getting logged in. Your cameras are off and you are muted, so you cannot be seen or heard. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please throw them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. And Bob did say that we can kind of go through as the presentation. If you have any fun recipes or anything fun to say, go ahead and throw it in the chat box, raise your hand, and we'll get to it. This webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything or if you want to share it with anybody, it should be on Conservation Nebraska's YouTube channel in just a few weeks. And at the end of the webinar, we will have a short poll that pops up on your screen. It's only about 3 questions. We would love if you fill it out. It helps us improve on our webinars and see what you guys are interested in. So with all that being said, let's dig into the world of edible plants with Bob Henrickson. He is the Horticulture Program Coordinator with Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, which is a program of the Nebraska Forest Society Service. Bob also hosts a live call-in gardening talk show called How's It Growin' on local radio in Lincoln. So definitely check that out. But I will hand it over to Bob to get us started.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Brianna. This is a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I must admit, it's a little weird, used to giving presentations where you can actually see your audience's faces. So I feel like I'm talking to my screen. So yeah, and like Brianna said, if anybody wants to, chime in the chat box, because hopefully I have some wild edible foragers tuning in that offer anything to anybody, saying, hey, Bob, you forgot to talk about this. This is what I use this plant for, or even a favorite recipe or a favorite resource that you use for wild edible plants, and how you learned about wild edible plants, and go from there. So love to see lots of comments in the chat box, and thanks again for tuning in tonight and listening to me, this crazy guy. This wild and crazy guy talk about wild edible plants. And one of my favorite subjects, I'm with the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, have been for like 20 years now, actually celebrating 20 years. And so this is near and dear to my heart, that plants are medicine and medicine is plants. I'm a firm believer in that. And so I want to also invite you, as Brianna mentioned, I host a gardening talk show called How's It Growing every Wednesday, 11 till noon on Lincoln's only community radio station, KZUM 89.3 FM. Anywhere in the world, you can tune in online at kzum.org. I encourage you to do that. It is the fastest hour in radio. Just had the show today at 11 o'clock. My inspiration for wild edible plants came from this person, naturalist Kay Young. And Kay used to be a naturalist at the Pioneers Park Nature Center, and she actually wrote a book called Wild Seasons. And in her book, she has this quote, which I firmly believe, when you think about wild edible plants, they're often thought of as, well, it must taste like cardboard, maybe with a little salt on it, right? No, this is products that rival the gourmet fare of anywhere in the world. And what's great is these plants, these nutritional plants, very nutritious plants and delicious plants, are often right under our noses, going overlooked and underutilized. So thank you, Kay, for being the source of inspiration for me. And as she says, certain wild plants are nutritious and tasty. Gathering involves discovery, exploration, and learning. And I think that's critical. It makes you pay attention to the time of year. That's one of the reasons her book is called Wild Seasons, because all throughout the seasons, whether it be winter, spring, summer, or fall, there's something delicious and nutritious you can harvest and use. And I will say there's so many plants to talk about. I probably won't be able to cover them all tonight, but I'm going to do my best. But just know if your favorite plant's not talked about, I apologize for that, but I don't want to keep you here till 10. Anyway, you can have these plants wild edible, could be right in your own backyard. It doesn't have to be in the back 40 or in the woodlands. But what happens there each season is important in your learning. And it really increases your awareness and understanding of wild things that help you make great choices that sustain us and not impede the natural systems. In other words, if you're more likely to use a plant for your food or for your medicine, you're more likely to want to preserve that wild patch where it's growing, right? It'll make you care about that plant and not just regard it as, oh, it's just some weed. And here's another inspiration. Melvin Gilmore wrote a book called Native American Uses of Plants in the Missouri River Region. Long title, but it was written back in 1914. And a quote from that book is here. There are large tracts of land in America whose bounty is wasted because the plants which can be grown on them are not acceptable to our people. And we'll talk about many of those plants, like the stinging nettle. Here's some good references, I think, to start. Here's Kay Young's book, The Wild Seasons, a great one for you to get and probably should be your first because it's local. And Kay does a great job, again, taking you through the seasons. There's some great resources online as well, but The Skillful Forager, I have this book at home. This is a really good one. And The Forager's Chef, Book of Flora, and Incredible Wild Edibles. Samuel Thayer has a great blog that you can listen to. There's some great foraging blogs and websites online that if you Google nutrition of or health benefits of or how to harvest or what it looks like, all these great websites and others tell you how to prepare them, recipe ideas, they're all great. So love them all. So I won't signal any out. And then finally, just this quick quote here, recorded way back in 1910 by Huron Smith, who wrote the following about the Potawatomi people. And I probably, well, maybe I'll read through the whole thing. They took full advantage of their native wild fruits, nuts, seeds, and other edible plants that occur freely in our region and have often expressed themselves as being well satisfied with the native foods. So folks, they weren't just survival food. They were great tasting, nutritious foods. And they believe today that many of the white man's diseases have been brought to them by the changing from their aboriginal types of foods to the white man's food. In these wild foods, they assert that they found certain chemicals and salts which kept them in health in the early days, and they were not subject to the diseases from which they suffer today. And I think that's true for any culture. All of the wild plants around us should sustain us both medicinally and culinarily. Okay, so let's get into this. Let's start in the wild seasons. And one of the best things you can forage is in the springtime after a long winter of, canned goods and non-fresh produce. The spring greens are the best thing out there after a long winter. And these greens show up very early in the spring, oftentimes late March, maybe even mid-March, depending on the year. But one of the favorites of myself and many friends that I know is stinging nettles. And I learned about this plant again from Kay Young's Wild Seasons. There you can see the little barbs on stinging nettles that give it its name. They're like little needles, right, that stick into your skin and irritate your skin. But those needles are rendered useless once you cook wild nettles. So those barbs will go away once you immerse it in boiling water, and you can blanch them for a minute or two and then cool them down or saute them up in a skillet. Those barbs basically melt away within seconds. Or if you dry your nettles, the barbs also are rendered useless. So after you dry that, you can handle them without getting stung. But we go out and harvest the stinging nettles very early in the year. It's pretty much the first plant we harvest. And this is a nice patch of stinging nettles that's, probably around 6 inches to a foot high. And then you just kind of get your thumb and your forefinger right around the stem, trying to avoid the leaves. Or you can wear what we do is surgical gloves. So you wear gloves to keep your hands from being stung. But if you thank the plant properly for its bounty, I encourage you to collect without gloves, because if the plant stings you, it's just reminding you that, hey, buddy, I'm giving you some good food, so you got to pay the price. But anyway, it's an easy plant to identify in the woods. And you can't over harvest this plant. If you pluck the tops of this plant, you're not going to harm the plant. The plant will recover from that plucking and still grow up to do anything it would have done without you being there. So the plant is there for the taking. You can't over harvest it. And besides that, it's not native anyway. It was introduced for its food value and its medicine value. That's why it's here and why it's naturalized all over Nebraska and the United States. It was brought over here from Europe. It's not a native plant. But so there's Pat, my partner. She's not reacting to the sting of the nettles. She's reacting to the bounty that we were able to collect. That is a boatload of stinging nettles, folks. And again, we didn't hurt the patch a bit. We plucked off the top 4 inches, and now we're kind of processing it, if you will. And depending on where you collect, we typically wash that first, but other times we don't if it's a nice clean area. And obviously, wherever you're collecting, you want to be certain that it was an area that was not sprayed, whether it be drift or overspray, you know, a good safe area that's not necessarily adjacent to an agricultural field that's been sprayed all the time. So anyway, the leaves and the stems can both be eaten at the tender young plants up to 6 inches, cooked fresh, dried, and cooked later. But what's great about stinging nettles is after you blanch them and freeze them or dry them and then pull them out and reconstitute those dried leaves, they retain that quality flavor and most of all that color. Because sometimes when you blanch food and then you reconstitute it, I'll put oh gosh, what is it? Collard greens or kale, things like that. They kind of turn a khaki color after you thaw them out. The thing about stinging nettles is it's very high in what's called super chlorophyll. In fact, it possesses more chlorophyll than any other plant out there. So if you Google super chlorophyll health benefits, super chlorophyll is amazingly good for us to build up our immune systems. And that's one of the reasons you want to use this plant is, well, cold flu season is upon us. You can add it to vegetable stocks. It's particularly good with any egg or potato recipe. I mean, anywhere you would use cooked spinach, you can use nettles as a substitute. So you don't even have to grow spinach anymore with nettles around, or you can powder them and make homemade nettle noodles, which are also the bomb. So they're used in the spring, but you can also harvest them later on in the year as well, just the tips of the plant, but very loaded with nutrients and very high in protein. And the content of protein is even larger than in soybeans. So get that, right? And the dried leaves, we really like them. Our favorite use is nettle tea. Drying a boatload of nettles like that, breaking out nettle tea is a really delicious thing. And again, very good for you. And nettle beer is a countryside favorite in the British Isles. That's something we haven't done yet, but probably is on our wish list, bucket list of things to do. And of course, those of you that have chickens, you can feed it to your laying hens to improve the egg quality. And those of you that have horses probably know this already. Feeding nettle greens to your horses will help with skin conditions and make those dull coats become healthy and shiny. So good stuff. And oftentimes back in the day, they would feed nettles to a horse, maybe that was past its prime, but they still wanted to get a good price for it. They would feed the horse the nettles to improve its skin and dull coat. So it brought more at the market. So people also use the stinging portion of this plant for something called urtication. And that is when you intentionally touch the stinging parts of a plant to a joint that's inflamed. So think about an inflamed joint. Maybe you have arthritis or something. The idea of that sting is to bring blood circulation to that swollen area, providing relief. In fact, this plant, man, if you Google it, just the benefits and the uses and the history, you will have hours of reading. It has such a rich history that goes back for centuries. I encourage you to do that. At the same time you collect nettles, this plant will probably be nearby. And this is another common plant that I learned about because the Korean community goes down to Wilderness Park and collects this by the bagfuls. And I was always like, well, how do Koreans know about this plant? It's a North American native. It's not native to Korea at all, but yet they know about it. And by doing a little research, I found it's also called Sochan. And we know it as cut leaf coneflower. It's a black-eyed Susan or a Rudbeckia species. And Sochan, I think, is a more appropriate name, a Comanche name. And they're the ones, in my opinion, that taught the Koreans way back in the day that this makes good food. And so again, in the spring, as it's emerging, that's that picture there early in the spring. This is probably a mid-April shot. And the fresh tender greens, one of the earliest ones to emerge right with the nettles and highly nutritious. addition to your diet after a winter of stored foods. And this is another one you can eat fresh. You can blanch it and freeze it. You can saute it up and put it in with your stir fry. Lots of uses for Sochan, and I encourage you to read up more on it. It's one that's particularly high in minerals, more so than kale. So if you think kale's a superfood, Sochan's got it beat. That's what it looks like later on in the season when it's in bloom. This is probably a picture taken in September. And so it's a very big plant and kind of aggressive. So if you plant it in your home landscape, which I encourage you to do, you just want to plant it in a space where it doesn't take over a bed, maybe surrounded by turf grass so it has nowhere to run, or a rock and a hard place, as I like to say. But a beautiful plant in the garden. You can see the foliage looks very similar to this emerging foliage in the spring, but this emerging foliage is much more tender than this foliage later on in the year. Sure, you can still harvest it and eat it, but it's not going to be as palatable, certainly edible, but a little tougher and a little more bitter than it would be in the spring. That's why we want you to harvest it then. And dandelions, hopefully everybody knows about. The dandelion was actually, people were encouraged to plant this in their yards back at the turn of the century. People brought this plant over from across the pond. And the reason they brought it over from across the pond, i.e. Europe, was because of its health benefits and its nutrition and of course, great food stuff. So the entire plant is edible, and dandelion used historically to detoxify. And again, another one of those spring greens after a long winter of no fresh greens is where it really came about from and why it was used so much. But dandelion greens are easy to harvest, and I would encourage you, if you're going to collect them, again, make sure the area wasn't sprayed, obviously. But if maybe you've noticed a dandelion that's growing near a compost pile or in more rich soil, the dandelion can get huge versus some dandelion growing in the crack of a sidewalk or in really hard compacted soil. Those aren't worth harvesting because the dandelion's so small. You want to get them in rich soil. Heck, what if we even cultivated the dandelion and did plant it intentionally in good soil? Oh, heaven forbid, right? Because this country spends millions of dollars every year to eradicate this weed that is nutritious and delicious. So you can blanch them by immersing them in boiling water for 20 or 30 seconds, and that helps reduce the acrid taste before you add them to salads or sandwiches. And when they talk about a dandelion salad, they're not necessarily talking about a salad just of dandelion greens, but a portion of it is with the dandelion greens because it's a pretty bitter pill. But as you can see here, loaded with vitamins, 535% of the daily value of vitamin K. I don't know if that's 1 cup of dandelions. I forgot to put that down, but 112% of vitamin A. And high in fiber, C, B6, thiamine, riboflavin, the list goes on and on. Dandelion is a super food, no doubt about it. But there's other parts of the dandelion that you may not have thought of. Dandelion buds, and that at the base of the dandelion, before that flower comes up on that little naked stem and blooms as it comes up, if you look at the base of the dandelion, it's packed with these little flower buds. So you want to get those buds while they're still hard before they get, before they open up. And you can saute them, but you can also add them to about anything really. Keys, soups, curries, go ahead and get creative with them. But I think one of the most intriguing things for me, I'm a big fan of capers. I love them, but capers are a little pricey. So you can use these cute little dandelion flower buds to make your own homemade capers. And it's a good way to preserve them with that salt and vinegar acting as a preservative. The mixture can be canned for long term or stored in the refrigerator for a few months, and very easy recipe here. You can add some ingredients to it, some garlic, a little juniper berries, some pink peppercorns, and add that with your salt water and non-chlorinated water. Good stuff. And of course, you can add those little balls to salads, pastas, cheese, whatever trips your trigger. There's lots of different uses for them. And then, of course, I can't leave out the flowers. The flowers, the yellow petals, you want to separate from that green calyx as best you can, because that green calyx will make whatever you're making out of it bitter. So dandelion wine is a very popular thing, and still haven't made dandelion wine, but it's on our bucket list to do, collecting all those flowers. does take time. And for dandelion wine, you need a boatload of flowers. So on our bucket list, one of these years, we will get it done. But it makes a beautiful wine and a quite tasty wine as well. My friend Jill, one of her favorite uses of dandelion flowers is to make dandelion syrup. It rivals any honey out there. It's just a simple syrup that steeped with the dandelion petals. And as you can see, it's a beautiful golden yellow color and delicious and tasty any way you would use honey. And then there's Dandelion Hearts. And the Dandelion Hearts, another thing you could say is the crown of the plant. So the crown of the dandelion is, you know, where the leaves meet the roots, that space in between, that white portion down here. So you're trimming away the leaves and using them for another recipe, and then cutting away the roots and using them for another purpose, but then saving those trimmed up hearts. And of course, washing them very well, because they're dirty little buggers. They'll hide dirt in there. And that's the last thing you want is, you know, when you're cooking it up to have dirt in your food, right? But very delicious. And as foragers like to say, the best part of the dandelion. And this dish here is just sauteed dandelion hearts over chickpea puree. What is chickpea puree? Help me out here. I know. Now, anyway, so the dandelion root, once you get that root, you dry the root and you can roast it and cut it up into little pieces like this and store it, and then make dandelion root tea. So read up on the health benefits of dandelion root tea, or that those roasted dandelions can also be made into a tincture, or you can use the fresh dandelion root for a tincture as well, because the root has probably the most powerful medicine. And you're going to want to collect that root in the fall on a new moon, when all that energy is going down into that root system, rather than in the spring when all that plant's energy is going up into the new tops. So that's why we harvest the greens in the spring, the root in the fall. Not saying you can't harvest the root in the spring, but it's going to be much better for you and provide all those benefits by harvesting it in a new moon in the fall. A full moon cycle is just the opposite. All of that plant's energy during a full moon is going up into the top portions of that plant. So it's a good thing to kind of go by, when do I harvest, with a large harvest window, and that's paying attention to the moon cycles. Cleavers is another one. And this one I have to thank my friends Sharon and Brian Olmberger, a couple of great foragers that taught me about the value of this plant. Also called bed straw. This is that plant that you throw at a friend and it clings to them. A weed that's really kind of taken over a lot of areas, and really a lot of people spray it. But little do they know, this plant has much to offer for us. And we like to collect it early in the spring when it's emerging. And if you find a big patch of this weed, it's an easy harvest to get a whole bunch of it. You can make it, cook it up fresh, add it to salads, make a fresh tea. But I think to get a whole bunch of it, we like to dry it. And we made a tincture out of it. And then we have dried cleavers right now for tea over the winter time, if you feel the cold and flu coming on, for example. So I like that. It tastes like spring. It's fresh, it's green. You know, if you just tried it out in the woods and said, what does it taste like? Well, I don't know, it just tastes green. It tastes like chlorophyll, which is good stuff. Anyway, I like throwing these hard words up here because people have actually studied the contents of this plant. This plant is another one that's been used for centuries in foreign cultures. It was brought over here to America for its food value, and more importantly, for its medicinal value. And it's a valuable lymphatic tonic and diuretic. And the lymph system, of course, is the body's mechanism to wash tissue of toxins, passing them back into the bloodstream to be cleansed by the liver and kidneys. So this is very much a cleansing herb. And also it can be applied externally for treating conditions like psoriasis, eczema, arthritis, which benefit from purifying the blood as well, from drinking tea on the inside. So works as an outstanding facial wash. And it tightens your skin. So cleavers, actually, you can find them and see it sold online from health food type places. I'm like, shoot, don't spend any money buying that plant. Just make sure you go out and collect it. And I must admit, still haven't made cleaver tea, but that's definitely going to be something during tea season, as I like to call it, is the winter months approach for that nice, cozy, what am I going to have for my nighttime tea? let Cleavers be on that list. And there is a picture of it in a tincture. And a tincture is just basically a quart jar filled half full, packed half full with herbs. And then you can use either pure grain alcohol or vodka, anything 80 proof or above. I know people that use, not just alcohol or vodka, but, rum or bourbon, things like that. So it doesn't have to just be vodka, but I'll warn you, if you use pure grain alcohol, phew, that stuff is intense and a little too intense for many folks. So vodka is good enough. Anyway, yeah, slightly older Cleavers, get a little tougher, but they can be, added to your meals, boiling them first. But anyway, it's very rich in vitamin C. So don't just regard this as a weed. Try it and include it in your diet. And get this, in cultures, I think around Turkey is where it's native from, in that area, the Mediterranean. And they actually harvest huge swaths of Cleavers and then put them over screens and dry them. And those little balls that you see right here on the plant will dry and fall through the screens. And then they collect those and grind them and use them as we would use coffee. But when you think of coffee, coffee's not necessarily good for us, right? But they drink Cleaver as a coffee substitute. Well, it's related to coffee, first of all, but highly nutritious in that form. I must admit, have certainly not done that yet because it sounds rather labor intensive, but that doesn't mean you can't experiment. And get this, ground ivy. Ground ivy is another weed that as a culture, we spend millions of dollars to eradicate every year by spraying. People ask, how do I get rid of this? Maybe it's time we need to embrace ground ivy. It's all around us trying to, bump us a little bit and go, hey, buddy, use me. And speaking of that, I have good friends, Jack and Casey, that taught me maybe the better name for this plant would be Purple Buddy. Because if we named it Purple Buddy, we might be apt to look at it as a buddy rather than something with a creeping name like Creeping Charlie, because that's another name for this. So the bitter leaves, if you just sample it out in the garden or whatever, and it's still green right now, you could go out there and harvest some. You'll notice it's very bitter, but it's used in a salad green in many countries. In fact, cultures still carry around seeds in their pocket to plant it places that they go because of its virtues. It was brought over here not as a weed. It was brought over here for its food value, flavoring value, and of course, for medicine. So anyway, so introduce yourself to ground ivy, another spring green. And then violets, violets are around all over the place too. Some people have them in their yard, and I have people that want to get rid of violets every year. They think they're going to take over their world, and they'll kind of move around here and there, but I've never seen them completely overtake a garden. And maybe if they do, you just say, fine, I'll just harvest some of your bounty and take advantage of your virtues. And, it's also another one that's rich in minerals, as you can see there, like calcium, magnesium, and it nourishes our body. And the new spring leaves are fresh and not as bitter as harvesting later in the summer and the fall. So you want to get this plant in the spring. But yeah, so the leaf can be used topically and made into a balm or a salve. And if you've never made a homemade lotion, cream, lip balms, salves, they're very easy to make. And the great thing about having the internet now is if you just type in how to make whatever the salve may be, there's a recipe out there that talks about it. And if you're not satisfied with that recipe, move on to another one, because you'll find a number of recipes out there on how to make a homemade salve or a lotion. Again, they're very easy to make. And talk about a cool Christmas gift. You could order these cool little containers and maybe make a half a dozen salves and put that on your bucket list for next year and give those out as Christmas gifts, because they make great Christmas gifts, and the people that get them very much appreciative of that. Here you can see the violet flowers have often been used to make a delicious jelly, and you can also make a vinegar. This is the violet flowers infused in a vinegar to make a violet vinaigrette, if you will. So lots of uses. And of course, the flowers are completely edible too, meaning you could have your Martha Stewart moment and just put it on a salad and have fun with it that way. Daylilies. So, you know, the orange flowered ditch daylilies, as they're often referred to, and oh, love them or hate them. And most people hate them because they take over their world and they're aggressive and this and that. I say start eating them and you'll be pleasantly surprised. First of all, the flowers you're looking at are also completely edible. And you don't want to do the Asiatic lily. You want the daylily. The Asiatic lily is not edible. And so you have to learn, if you don't know a daylily, you have to learn what that looks like first. But there's nothing more fun than pulling off a flower in front of somebody that's not a forager and eating it right in front of them and seeing that look on their face like, dude, you got to be kidding me. You're eating the flower, like gross. No, it's tasty. In fact, recipes out there will show filling that flower, the interior portion, removing the anthers here and filling it with a cream cheese mixture and having them fresh like that. And talk about a potluck you go to that has, cream filled daylily blossoms. You're going to look pretty cool having that colorful dish. But this is what we like to do with daylilies. We know of a couple of patches, big patches, and we hit these up in early spring. That's my little dog, Claire, that always used to go hiking with her, bless her soul. She's no longer with us, but it's good to see my little dog in that pic. But this is the time to harvest daylilies. So the daylilies, as they emerge in the spring, they have kind of a thick base before all those leaves unfurl and show its true self. Those leaves are all kind of wrapped around each other, kind of like a leek is. They're in, well, what did Shrek say? You have layers like an onion. Well, the daylily has layers too. So you want to harvest it early enough where that stalk is still intact. In fact, the base of this stalk is about a 1/2 inch thick. And this white portion, the leafy portion here is still edible, but it's kind of tough. So we harvest it like this, cut most of the leaves away. But then when we're preparing it, we'll cut all those top leaves away and just take this stalk and use that for whether you saute it, use it fresh in a salad. What we found, it has an incredibly long shelf life. So storing these stalks in a bag in the refrigerator, they'll last for several weeks. And really love them, that crunch. To me, when we taste them, it tastes kind of like peas, snap peas, snow peas. So a good way to use up those daylilies. And yeah, anyway, no matter, wait, I don't think I had the right there. There's string being mild onion flavor. There's not really a mild onion flavor. I must have messed up there and typed in something I didn't intend to. But again, they taste more like green peas than anything. Anyway, the flower buds, before they open up, these are a mainstay in Chinese cooking and in stir fries. And I like to harvest, I'm sure you can harvest them at this bud stage here, but when you can see the color in the flower bud before it opens like this is a good place to just, snip it off with your thumb here at the base, and then you can saute them. You can eat it fresh, of course, and they're delicious fresh and have almost a peppery aftertaste. But I love them used in stir fries or just a brief sauteing. Very good thing to do. And of course, again, daylilies are big in China, and they're sold as golden needles in Chinese grocery stores and traditionally used in hot and sour soups. So you can dry the flowers and use them as well. So the daylily has much to offer. Again, why was the ditch daylily brought over here? It wasn't brought over here for ornament, folks. It was brought over here for its food value, plain and simple. Plus, I could make the trip from Pennsylvania to Nebraska in a covered wagon and still survive, right? Much like peonies or iris or things like that, the historic homesteading flowers that people brought with them. So there it is, the flowers with the cream cheese mixture in the center, very gorgeous. You can actually fry that flower with a fritter batter too. You can dip it in a fritter batter and fry it first, but it can get a little messy. This is a lot easier to deal with, just stuffing them and making a very pretty presentation. The roots are also edible. They're a lot more work than just taking the tops, but here you can see the emerging plant in the spring, that stalk I was telling you about. This is the edible part we eat, but these little tubers are tasty as well, but they're just a lot more work to get at. But it's another one that I would harvest in the fall rather than the spring. So you could harvest these spring greens, not hurt the plant a bit, and then go back in the fall, dig up some, divide it, and save those little tubers. They can be roasted, sauteed, whatever, but they're tasty little fellows. That's for, like little fingerling potatoes. So there you see the little tubers, and then the stalks for the top part, you know, cutting those up and using them, eating them fresh in a salad or sauteing them, stir fry, whatever. Lots of use. Another cool spring green is sourdock. And sourdock is another one of those plants that was brought over from across the pond. Guess what? For its medicinal value. And of course, it's food stuff as well. But sourdock, Kay Young's grandchildren, she told me, affectionately call this plant the doctor plant because of all of its medicinal benefits. And I encourage you to read up on its medicinal benefits because it's amazing medicine. And I can attest to that, using it topically for back pain or joint pain, muscle pain. It is the bomb. And making a homemade salve out of the yellow dock is another name for it. The root, the inside of the root is very yellow, hence the name. So yeah, dock has very mucilaginous juice in it. And so that mucilaginous juice, think of aloe vera, right? Is kind of that slimy juice of aloe vera. Dock has that same quality with it. So often dock is growing close by stinging nettles, or it's growing close by poison ivy. So if you happen to get poison ivy or stinging nettles, it's a good one to rub on that affected area, and it takes that sting away and certainly reduces, if not eliminates, the rash from poison ivy. So if you're one of those people where poison ivy jumps out at you, look for dock to save the day. So here are the spring greens. You want to get these early in the year when they're just emerging, because later on in the year, they just get a little tough and bitter. So early in the spring is best when the plant is emerging, easy to harvest. And these leaves can get rather long. That midrib, some references will say cutting out that midrib because the tender leafy part cooks much faster than that tender midrib. Anyway, it can easily compete with known veggies in terms of nutrition, high in fiber, and more vitamin A in its leaves than equal amount of carrots. Now, of course, you'd probably have to eat a lot to get that vitamin A, but still, it's packed with nutrition. And but get this, the plant has been used since 500 BC and has many medicinal properties, most of which are based in the plant's roots. So again, we can harvest the spring greens and then turn around in the fall. November right now is probably the best time of year because again, all that energy is going down into that root system. Now we're just getting into a full moon cycle. So you should have harvested maybe a couple of weeks ago, but it is what it is. If you know the soil's not frozen, get out there and harvest it. And better yet, I had a sourdock plant right next to my garden. So it was big and robust, and I basically dug it up and harvested that root last year and made a tincture out of it in a salve. But get this, the seeds were also collected, and when they're dry to the touch, you can grind them and create a flour, which has a flavor similar to buckwheat. And it's actually a relative of buckwheat. So, and it, of course, can be used as a coffee substitute, and actually was affectionately called coffee weed by a number of authorities. That I have not tried yet, but it's definitely on my bucket list to see, is it worth it? And I think that's what you'll find out the more you experiment with wild foods. Was it worth my efforts? Here is some sausage links, and these could be vegan sausage links, whatever. But it's just sausage links rolled in dock leaves and then baked in the oven. And those leaves, of course, cooked down and basically kind of adhered themselves to the links, much like you would with stuffed grape leaves. You can do the same thing with sourdock. So good stuff, the dock, the doctor plant. Okay, and then lamb's quarters, awesome plant, really. It's all over the place. And according to commercial agriculture, this is the worst weed in North America for commercial ag to battle. And what that means is, again, millions upon millions of dollars are spent eradicating this weed because it competes with corn and soybeans. Well, you can have your cake and eat it too with this one, saying, I'll reduce your numbers by eating you. So it's another invasive plant from Europe that was brought over for, guess what? food and medicine. So again, if anything you learned today, just know a lot of the things we regard as weeds came here for a reason. And the more you learn about these plants, the more you'll give them respect that they deserve. They're not just weeds. Anyway, you want to harvest the tender young plants in the spring. Again, if you wait until the plant gets big and tall, the leaves get a little more bitter and a little tougher. So the early leaves are easy to harvest. And if you harvest a boatload of them, more than you can use for that night's meal, it's simple to blanch them and freeze them in Ziploc bags. And blanching is simply putting fresh leaves, whether it be nettles or dock, you know, or violets leaves or lamb's quarters. You're basically immersing them in boiling water for a minute or two, and then immediately taking them out of that boiling water, straining them, and then putting them in ice water bath. And that stops the cooking process and still keeps them fresh and a little al dente, rather than, you know, cooking them to a point where they're falling apart, right? So you just want to stop that process so you can freeze them so they don't deteriorate in the freezer. That's why you need to blanch them first. You can dry them, but this one is much easier to freeze and reconstitutes very well. In Kay Young's book, she has creamed lamb's quarter greens with wild mushrooms. It's the hit of any potluck you go to. I'm telling you, it's so good. And if you try lamb's quarters fresh, you might just say, yeah, whatever, just tastes green. But once you cook it, it transforms this plant into a yummy cooked green. And again, one of its best uses with eggs, stews, soups, quiches, omelets, you know, anything like that. Easy to harvest and very nutritious. Not a very good picture, whoops, but this is purslane. And purslane is another one of those plants that has that mucilaginous juice in it. This is more of a, not necessarily a early spring green, but more of a summer green. Purslane loves the hot, humid weather of Nebraska. And guess what? It was brought over for its medicine and nutritional food value. It's another introduced weed that, again, is the disdain of many gardeners. But if you've ever noticed purslane growing in more rich soil, the leaves can get up to 1.5 inches versus purslane growing in the crack of a sidewalk where the leaves stay very small. So reserve a spot for those weeds and actually grow those weeds. So the thick leaves and stems can be cooked or eaten fresh. And I know one of Kay's favorite uses for purslane leaves was using them in tacos in place of lettuce, because they add a nice crunch to that taco, and they don't wilt like the lettuce wilts. And get this, it's the richest known source of any plant of omega-2. And that is omega-2 is what we're all after for the nutrition in plants. So read up on purslane and include it in your diet. You'll be glad you did. And I like how Kay described its flavor. It's slightly sour with a texture that is both crunchy and slick. And what that slick means is kind of a fancy way of saying it's kind of slimy, but I wouldn't call it slimy. It's more slick. It's not a bad texture in your mouth. You know what I mean? It doesn't create a bunch of slime in your mouth like you might think, but it's very good stuff. Lots of good recipe ideas online on how to use purslane, but for a lot of foragers, it's their favorite green out there. So I encourage you to get to know this beauty as well. Yeah, some other great spring plants that I'm not showing you pictures on, but just quickly to mention, like garlic mustard is an invasive weed that has really taken over a lot of woodland areas in Nebraska, especially pristine woodland areas. It's very invasive and it chokes out the natives. Well, I say take advantage of garlic mustard and harvest it again, and lots of it. It makes a fantastic pesto, as does stinging nettles. That's one thing I forgot to mention with stinging nettles is you don't have to wait for basil season to make your homemade pesto. Make pesto out of stinging nettles and you'll be glad you did. But I also like sweet cicely, Solomon seals, the shoots or the roots, of course, mulberries, gooseberries, plantain, red clover, yarrow, linden trees, young leaves and flowers, elm tree seeds. We'll be talking about those as we get further along into today's presentation. Okay, Another green that I'm becoming more familiar with is spiderwort. And maybe you have this in your garden. There's more of an eastern species out there called Virginia spiderwort. We have a Nebraska, three Nebraska natives. One is called Ohio spiderwort, which is this one. I have it in our yard, and the spiderwort was used for various food and medicinal purposes. It's another one that has that mucilaginous juice in it. And a tea made from the plant was used as a laxative and to treat stomach aches associated with overeating. So like an after dinner tea. So that mucilaginous juice, much like aloe vera, coats, soothes, and relieves. So taking it internally, ingesting it is going to coat and soothe your digestive portions of your body. So the young leaves can be eaten. The whole plant's edible. You can eat the flowers. It really doesn't taste like anything, to be honest with you. The leaves just kind of taste green. But if you have it at home and enjoy it as a garden plant, just remember it'll give you good food too. You can eat it fresh as a salad green, or fry it, boil it until tender. But again, you want to get it earlier in the spring before the leaves get tougher. So think about spiderwort, look it up, and see what you think about adding this to your wild edible diet. It's a good one for that. So I'll quickly jump into prairie teas. And these are plants, wild plants you could find out there, out and about. We have lead plant is an awesome plant. And it had other uses too. Here's some of the Native American uses out of Melvin Gilmore's book. But it makes a delicious prairie tea. You dry the leaves, and here's the little leaflets here. You can remove them from that stalk, simmer it for at least 4 minutes. So there it is, the dried leaves, and then simmering as tea. And then there's a picture of the tea. It's a very tasty tea, very mild tea. And it's one of those things where you strain it, you can reuse those leaves for 2 more brewings. And I don't know of another tea plant that can give you 3 brewings out of the same batch of leaves. It's pretty impressive that way. Mountain mint makes a great tea, and this is one you can grow in your garden as well, just like the lead plant, and you should. Mountain mint attracts a plethora of pollinating insects, but the leaves emerging in the spring or later on in the summer give you a whole lot to harvest for tea. And I like making fresh summer teas out of it, where I'll just harvest a handful of the leaves and then put them in a pitcher of water, put the pitcher of water in the refrigerator and forget about it for 3 days. And then you have what's called a cold brew tea. And cold brew tea is very good for us nutritionally versus a hot tea that kind of, the cooking kind of cooks out some of those plants' nutrients. A cold brew tea is much better for us. And then maybe you've heard of New Jersey tea, a fantastic prairie plant. And yes, they called it New Jersey tea for a reason. It's very good for us. And there's a picture of the flowers. Beautiful plant for the garden. Pollinating insects love it. There's the seed heads, but the leaves are what we're after to make a delicious tea. And if you have it in your garden, try using it. And then wild bee balm, the Monarda species. This is an easy plant to grow in the garden. It should be in everybody's garden. It's powerful medicine, but it also makes a very delicious tea. There's the flowers and the leaves here. Is what I harvest. Of course, when it's in bud stage like this is a good part to get to the plant too for making a tea. But cold and flu symptoms is what it's typically used for. So it could become your go-to herb for a pleasant tea, but also a very medicinal tea for cold and flu season, which somebody tells me, well, we're in it right now, right? So it could become your go-to, very much useful plant. It's packed with an essential oil called thymol, and thymol, THYMOL, has a lot of studies going on using thymol, and thymol is the main essential oil that's in the thyme plant. So we call it thymol versus thymol. Go figure where we call thyme, not thyme. I don't know why. And then finally, a great tea, rose petals. Making rose water is a great thing. And I have friends that make rose petal syrup, easy to make and one of nature's most delectable treats. That's Kay Young's words. The wild rose hips can also be harvested and used to make a tea, very high in vitamin C. A lot more work to do the rose hips. The flower petals are much easier to make a tea out of or a syrup. So I encourage you to do that. Okay. So Brianna, I noticed, oh, this is the fastest hour on radio. It's already 10 till 8. So maybe I should kind of stop here for a minute and let's see if there's any questions or anything anybody wants to talk about.
Yes, we had some great comments in a lot of comments about recipe ideas and just different helpful hints. But we do have a couple questions. The first one is from Tim. He asked, how much light and water do nettles need?
And I'm assuming she's meaning that light and water if I'm to grow them in my own garden. And the nettles, you're not going to have to worry about water. Whatever Mother Nature gives them, once you get the plant established, they're on their own. You won't have to water your nettles to get them to grow. I think the main problem or disadvantage, you may call it, is they can be kind of aggressive and they will run. So I know some people that will actually, like my friend Sue, she grows it. She has a bathtub out there in the garden, kind of submerged. So she plants it in a place where it can't spread out of control. But it's easy to keep it in control if you just maybe have it in its own bed, maybe a 6x6 foot bed. That this is my stinging nettle patch, and I'm going to surround it in between a rock and a hard place. And that rock and a hard place could just be surrounding it with turf grass and then mowing your grass. The nettle is not going to spread out into your grass. It's going to stay confined into that bed, if that makes sense. But very easy to grow in the garden. And I know a number of people that do have it in their garden for that reason, because again, sometimes you can't trust the places you're collecting wild edible plants, right? Was it sprayed? How can I be sure? Well, if you grow it in your backyard, you don't have to worry about that. It's right out your kitchen door.
Awesome. And while we're answering questions, I am gonna launch the poll if you guys can take it. It's just 3 questions really quick. And our next question is, can a person eat other types of black-eyed Susans other than the ones you showed?
Oh yeah, great question. That's a great question, and one I have to say I don't know. I never looked into that. Is it just this species of black-eyed Susan? I guess since I don't know that, I'm going to stick to, well, yes, it is the only one, but I honestly don't know. And I think for you to ask that question, I would say inquiring minds want to know. Google it, look it up, and see if there's any other species. You could just say black-eyed Susans for wild foraging or whatever you would type in. But yeah, that golden glow is another name for it. Cut leaf coneflower, it has a lot of different names, and it's just a really easy plant to grow in the garden. We have it at home, and we go out in the woods and harvest it by the bagful, but having it in your own home garden is an easy thing. And again, you could plant it in a location where it doesn't go crazy, kind of bordering some turf grass, or maybe in between a side shed and some turf grass where you're giving it a little bit of space, because this plant is so easy. You can't kill it by underwatering it or overwatering it. Oh, and I forgot to answer that person's question about sun for the nettles. Nettles are very shade tolerant, so it can take part shade for sure. I wouldn't want to put it in dense shade, but the thing is, emerging in the spring so early, the leaves aren't even on the trees yet. So just the shadows from the branches, the sunshine is going to shine through those deciduous trees onto the nettles and get them to do fine. So part shade does just fine.
Awesome. We got a few more questions. Can a person eat any daylily that isn't the Asiatic?
Oh yeah, great question. Oh yeah, that isn't the Asiatic, right? I had to digest that last part. You're right, the Asiatic is not edible. I have to bring that home again, but you're right, even your standard garden center daylilies, your hybrid daylilies as they're often called, are just different species of Hemerocallis. All the Hemerocallis are native. In fact, there's a species from China, Hemerocallis middendorfii. There's a tongue twister for you, but middendorfii is actually available. I ordered the plant from Oikos Tree Crops, of all places, had it available, and I was intrigued, going, well, this is a species I've never heard of, but yet it's in the wilds of China, it's regarded as 5-star food. So I'm like, I better get this. And I learned I have it at home, and the poor plant for various reasons, still hasn't been able to give me a harvest because it's been moved around. It's been abused. So anyway, but yes, you can do any old daylily. I would just say to you, if you're choosing your hybrid daylilies that have those big, beautiful flowers, it's going to be kind of hard for you to eat all those. So pick on the ditch daylilies because they're a dime a dozen.
I love it. Samantha asked, I'm new to wild harvesting. How do you know when a place is safe to harvest from? Are state parks generally safe?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, how do you know? I think for me, a lot of the places I go to is the woods. And I feel a little safer deep into the woods rather than the edge of a farm field, right? And or next to a waterway that may be accepting poison from a nearby farm field. And it's sad to say that, but that's the world we live in. And obviously the safest way we can do is approach our own backyard, our own yards is places we can actually plant these things. And if we already have them as weeds, we don't spray them out, but we go, I can learn to live with you if I eat you because I know I'll value you more. But no, you can kind of observe the land around you. Has this been sprayed? The plants will be showing signs, the curling leaves, the cup leaves. They will be obviously distorted to you if that area has been sprayed. But again, if we go to areas that are more deep in the woods and those wildlife management areas, places like the game and parks and others that manage those areas aren't going around and spraying those wildlife management areas. There would be nothing for them to spray for. That being said, obviously you're going to err on the side of caution, right? And observe the plants around you. But about the only thing they would go in and spray for is invasive plants on the noxious weed list, like say, for example, what am I thinking of? Thistles. So the thistles, to control them, they're not going to go around and just blanket spray these huge areas. And the main reason they're not going to do that is the cost, and the cost again. And of course, being a wildlife management area, they don't want to be somebody that's using a lot of chemicals anyway, right? So at the very most, they're going to spot spray those invasive noxious weeds, not the wild edibles you're after.
Awesome, man. I love all these questions coming in. We have so many. Rachel asked, what's the best way to source plants to add to my garden?
What's the best place to source plants to add to my garden? And I'm assuming she means the wild edible plants, the sourcing of the wild edible plants, right? Right. I would assume that's what you mean. And that's why Kay Young's book is really good, because it's a good, I don't want to call it, it's more of a beginner, right? So say you're a beginner at foraging and you're not sure what to do or which plants. What Kay does in her book is, first of all, inspire you, especially in the introduction, because she interviewed a lot of people in writing this book, from Native American elders to people in nursing homes, because, oh, my grandma used to make jelly out of that, right? We all heard things like, well, my grandma used to use it, but it died with my mom's generation, or they just never knew. When she interviewed those people, the folks at the nursing home said, well, she's not talking much, so you probably won't get much out of her. And once she started talking about gathering wild foods, their face lit up. They remembered what they wore that day, what the weather was like. Was it breezy? Was it, what was the weather like? They remembered. So there's something inherently humane about us being foragers, right? We're built for foraging. Humans like to collect things, right? And what better thing to collect than wild edible plants, right? So it really teaches you, as Kay puts in her book, to pay attention to the seasons, to pay attention to the day, because once the season starts, and for a lot of us, well, that's now, the season never ends. You could literally harvest something every day. I'm not kidding. Time will be your enemy, but you could harvest something every day from the wilds. And sometimes, again, those wilds can be in our backyard. So start with Kay's book, because she talks in there. Also great to grow in your own backyard. She will list those plants that you could actually seek out and grow in your own backyard.
Awesome. And we do have a lot of questions about this is being recorded, so it will be on YouTube in a few weeks. And if you want it sooner, it's being recorded so I can share it with you. And also I will be sending an email out tomorrow to everybody with some of the info that Bob talked about, the books and all that good stuff. So you'll have that information right in front of you. So
You know,
yeah.
one thing I should say too is folks, I tried to get through a lot of plants, and I'm telling you, I've got a lot of plants yet in this PowerPoint. So maybe there would be a way to share the PowerPoint so you could just kind of scroll through it on your own leisure, because there's lots of great plants, including this one still up here on the screen, purple poppy mallow, that I'd love to introduce you to. We just not enough time in the day. but I'm sure we can do that, right, Biana?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Cool.
I'll get that in the email for tomorrow. Yes.
Excellent.
Perfect. All right. So we have a question from Sienna. She said, whenever I try to cook purslane, it gets limp and slimy in a bad way. Any cooking tips?
Yeah, good question. And to be honest with you, I've never cooked it for that reason. I think it's one, at least for my personal taste, I think there's some recipes on there, and I know Kay has one in her book. I should have looked up it. It's like purslane casserole, but I don't know if she addresses that slimy nature. It's kind of like, if anybody, I'm a big fan of okra, and if anybody has cooked okra, they know it was used as a soup thickener, gumbo and things like that, right? That it has that same mucilaginous quality. It's in the mallow family. Oh, and get this, the one up on the screen, purple poppy mallow, is also related to okra. It's in the mallow family as well. It has that same slimy mucilaginous property. So I would say to you, you know, use your purslane for fresh eating, you know, and yeah, and somebody may chime in with the chat box that it has cooked with it to be able to offer, because I have to plead ignorance. I've never cooked with it yet, but again, I just think it's much better eating fresh, but I don't know of its cooked qualities and recipes, because I've never tried Kay's purslane casserole. It's on my bucket list.
All right. And we do have a question. You might have answered it already. Where do you find woods to harvest in?
Where do you find woods to harvest in? Well, if you're from Lincoln, I love Wilderness Park. And I know, you know, a lot of folks may say, yeah, but if everybody harvests in Wilderness Park, you're going to over harvest and the plant will die and you'll get rid of it. Every plant you saw me talk about in the spring greens was introduced. Did you notice the reoccurring theme? It was brought over from across the pond for food and medicine. And now they've become a weeds that we spend millions of dollars to eradicate. And so there's not only that part of it, meaning they didn't belong here in the first place. So you can't over harvest. And besides that, if you say, well, yes, you can, I'm just pinching the top portions of that plant off. All that plant's energy is still underground. It's still going to come out and do everything it was going to do before I even harvested it. So literally the plant is trying to shake us humans, going, I am here for you. Take advantage of me, please. Can't over harvest. But yeah, Wilderness Park, you know, wildlife management areas, state parks for sure. Anywhere where there's good sizable woods around them is a good place to go.
Sweet. And Martin asked, and I'm going to butcher this word, but epazote is one weed that is used in Mexico. Are there some sort of this here in Nebraska?
I didn't quite hear that.
Oh, sorry. Martin asked, epazote, EPAZOTE, is a weed used in Mexico. And he was wondering if we have anything similar here in Nebraska.
Let's see. You know, I don't. Okay, I pulled up the question here because I was like, epazote, however you'd pronounce that. No, I'm not familiar with that one. But again, inquiring minds want to know. I'm going to have to look that baby up, but I don't know of that in Nebraska. And I don't want to say, well, if I haven't heard of it, it doesn't exist. No, that's not the case. Oh, and watercress. Yeah, that's on my bucket list, Martin, too. And, you know, I've never come across watercress in Nebraska. I'd be a little nervous about it because one of the plants I was going to talk about is cattails. As a boy, my uncle would harvest cattail shoots, and I thought they were tasty even as a kid. But now I'm afraid to harvest cattail shoots because they're near a waterway. And if we tested the water, I'm not sure I'd want to eat them. Same thing with watercress. If it's growing in a waterway, unless it's your backyard water garden, are you going to trust that watercress is growing in? Because I'm probably not. Unfortunately, that's where we're at with our polluted water around this state. So I'd love to say, yes, I've harvested watercress, but definitely would love to. Let's see. And then I see this one here. I took an herb class and added purslane to brownies, and no one guessed the herb. Well, that sounds like a rather gnarly combination. Adding purslane to brownies? What? That's kind of gnarly. So Diane, were they tasty? Now I know no one guessed the herb, which I can imagine because I'm trying to think, well, who would add green stuff to a brownie? I've never had that. So I'm curious, Diane, how did it taste?
And while we wait for Diane, Marie asked, how do you know whether it's purslane or the other look-alike plant? She can't remember, but it's also additive. Which one has a darker, redder stem?
So how do you know if it's purslane or the other type of purslane? Is that kind of what you meant? Because there's a purslane out there. The garden centers sell purslane now as an ornamental. And to be honest with you, I don't know. I wouldn't trust those ornamental varieties. I would stick to the garden weed variety. And the only reason I say that is for one, I've never tried it because there's plenty of the weed around. And those garden center varieties were selected for the large flowers. The purslane that we all know is the weedy purslane, has very tiny flowers. So definitely not grown for its ornament. But the purslane you see at the garden centers, yeah, I would just stick to that being ornamental. That being said, if they list what the species is, and you can find out if the weedy purslane is the same scientific name as the garden cultivars, then by all means it's edible. I just haven't tried it yet. I'm assuming it is, but I would err on the side of caution and say I'm going to go with the weedy one.
Oh, and Diane said we were supposed to use an herb. Purslane had no real taste, so
That's funny. We were supposed to use an herb. It's like these brownies have to have an herb in them. And no, we're not talking about marijuana, right? Because I think that's what people typically put in brownies. Yeah, and interesting. Oh, how to differentiate spurge from purslane? Well, that's pretty easy. I think the leafy spurge or whatever spurge you're talking about, not sure which spurge. But spurge is, I think, a euphorbia species, and euphorbia is definitely poisonous. And the way you can tell a euphorbia, and the thing is too, somebody may ask a question, well, how do you know if it's edible or poisonous? Is learn your edible plants and disregard the rest. It's as simple as that. It's not rocket science. It's a finite number of edible plants, especially when you're talking about greens, right? But euphorbias, they have a milky sap. So if you pinch the stem or you pinch a leaf off, it should drip white milk, much like a milkweed plant does. Milkweed was another one I wanted to talk about, but ran out of time.
Man, well, thank you so much. All of the questions and tips and tricks in the chat box. I'll be sure to, get a link and send that on over to Bob also, because there's so many good information in here. But like I said, this is recorded, so it'll be on our YouTube in a few weeks. We'll get an email sent out to everybody with the PowerPoint, the books that Bob talked about, all that good stuff. And again, my name is Brianna Coma from Conservation Nebraska. And thank you so much, Bob. I seriously cannot thank you enough for putting this together. And your brain is just fantastic. I can't get enough of it.
Well, thanks. Plants are on my brain. I can't help it. And I'm seeing some of the comments. I see somebody saying maybe a second webinar. Yeah, you're right, dude. I haven't gotten to literally probably maybe 40% of the plants I wanted to show you or less. So
And
Thank you
before
so
this,
much, everyone.
yes, and before this, me and Bob were talking, and we were talking about maybe a medical, little edible
Plants
webinar.
as medicine, yeah.
Yeah, we'll see what the future holds. So stay in tune. Check out Conservation Nebraska's Facebook for more fun webinars and events that we have, and hopefully Bob will be back here soon. But thanks for sticking around. We went a little late, but we appreciate each and every one of you that are still here. Send in the love to Bob. We appreciate it so much. And have a good night,
Awesome.
everybody.
Thank you so much, Brianna. And yeah, if you know me, I typically don't end my presentations on time because there's too many plants to talk about. Cool. Well, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. See ya, everybody.
Bye. Thanks for tuning in.